Right, Des Thompson, the Principal Advisor on Science and Biodiversity for NatureScot, to come in here. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Nathan. And thanks everyone for joining us for this session. We're going to do this as a triple act. So we're going to show about 20 slides, just taking you through progress in developing the new 25-year biodiversity strategy for Scotland. And then we're looking forward to hearing from you with your views and hopefully being able to answer your questions. So without any further ado, I'm going to hand over to Sue first.
Thanks very much, Des. So let's set the Scottish Biodiversity Strategy into its wider context. If you look at the slide on the left here, you can see that in December 2020, Scotland published the Statement of Intent to tackle the biodiversity crisis. And NatureScot is looking to create a nature-rich future for all. And our strapline is protect, restore and value. The United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity, its Council of Parties, the 15th one of those will be happening in December, and that will produce a 2030 biodiversity framework for global action, which will have more than 23 targets. And NatureScot works with DEFRA and JNCC to influence those. And in this winter, Scotland will publish its new ambitious strategy. Looking at the infographic on the right-hand side of the slide, we can see that this illustrates the alarming current trend in biodiversity loss. We're on the grey line, that's the one at the bottom. So if we continue as we are, that loss will continue. The yellow line, the middle one, illustrates the path if we take conservation action alone. And the green line will only be achieved, that's the top line, that will only be achieved when increased conservation efforts are taken in tandem with more sustainable production and consumption. We're seeking to meet the green line, for biodiversity loss to be reversed by 2030 and by 2045 for us to have substantially restored and regenerated biodiversity across our land, freshwater and seas. We recognise that previous strategies have not delivered anywhere near as much as needed, and that's not just in Scotland. This new strategy will drive urgent stepped-up action. It will be a far more ambitious strategy than we've ever had in the past. The Programme Board steers its development and ensures engagement across government and more widely to embed biodiversity loss alongside climate change as the most important environmental challenge of our time. The Programme Board is co-chaired by NatureScot's Chief Executive and the Director of Scottish Government's Natural Resources Directorate. Also, since the Butte House Agreement and Minister Lorna Slater's appointment to the biodiversity portfolio, there's been great interest and importance being placed on this new strategy. Senior government officials at director level are represented on the board, including heads of marine, forestry, agriculture, climate change, national parks and planning. So just a bit more on COP15. The first part of that has happened, like so many things in the last couple of years, has been heavily impacted by COVID. So it was split into two parts, which is quite unusual. The first part happened in October 2021, and that was a virtual meeting hosted from Kunming in China. And the second and final part will be a face-to-face negotiation in Montreal from the 7th to the 19th of December this year. The aim of the COP is to agree international targets for biodiversity to 2030 and milestones and goals to 2050. These will form the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, which will be the guiding light for the new Scottish Biodiversity Strategy. Draft targets have already been produced through ongoing work of the CBD. You've probably heard of the 30 by 30 target, for example, where 30% of land and sea by area is conserved and protected by 2030. And we'll hear more on that from Christian shortly. However, as you'll see, we're not waiting for the CBD targets to be agreed before starting to determine what state we envisage for Scotland's biodiversity and the priority actions we need to undertake to deliver it. We know from our robust and reliable monitoring base, covering over 300 species, that Scotland's biodiversity is in serious decline. For example, from the State of Nature report, that reported that there was a 24% decline in abundance of recorded species since 1994, a 14% contraction in species range since 1970, and assemblages of species are becoming increasingly uniform, with generalists dominating over specialists, offering less diversity and resilience to the consequences of the changing climate and other pressures. We know that we need to prepare, our new strategy needs to deliver in a warmed world, the baked-in climate change, and we need to recognise it might go higher than 1.5 degrees. Coupled to this decline is the projected increases in global temperature that will continue to pose pressure along with others, like invasive non-native species, exploitation of the seas, and intensive land use through agriculture and forestry. And as biodiversity loss and climate change are inextricably linked, nature has a strong role to play in both mitigation and adaptation. For this reason, we're aligning the Scottish Biodiversity Strategy to Scotland's carbon reduction targets established in legislation to reduce emissions of all major greenhouse gases by at least 75% by 2030 and to reach net zero by 2045. So the case for urgent action is clear. In Scotland and elsewhere, as we emerge from the pandemic, we talk of a green recovery, to build back better from that shock and to build in resilience to current and future shocks. In doing so, we face a triple challenge or opportunity through green recovery to transition to a net zero economy, a just transition which will require major changes in the use of the land and sea with consequences for the state of nature. Also, adapting to climate change that is already happening, which will also require major changes in the use of the land and sea, and improving the state of nature by tackling the main drivers of biodiversity loss, including climate change, as highlighted in the IPBES report, which emphasises the importance of tackling the underlying indirect drivers too, for example, with higher environmental standards, improved market regulation, and more coherent incentives for land use, i.e. by integrating biodiversity across all of public policy. All three have to be done over the same period of time, from now to 2045, and forever, across the same areas of land and sea. As we've heard, the new biodiversity strategy needs to set out a transformational response to the intertwined crises of climate change and biodiversity loss. It will be a high-level strategy published this winter, and we've been working closely with Scottish Government, the Programme Advisory Group, and a wide range of stakeholders to develop the vision and outcomes or depictions of success. And this formed step 1 of a 3-step process. Step 2 looked at the levers, the conditions needed for success, and step 3 brought all this work together into a consultation document. The consultation opened in June and closes on the 12th of September. Please do respond to the consultation, it really will make a difference. The delivery plan is being developed in parallel with the strategy, and it's due to be published within 6 months of the strategy, but more on that later. This slide illustrates how the Scottish Biodiversity Strategy sits within a family of strategies under the Environment Strategy, and also has a family of strategies like the Pollinator Strategy and the Beaver Strategy feeding into it. It also shows how the new SBS will deliver the Convention on Biological Diversity's new Global Biodiversity Framework. That's shown on the right-hand side. So to reiterate, the draft vision is that by 2045, we will have substantially restored and regenerated biodiversity across our land, freshwater and seas. Our natural environment of plants, animals, insects, aquatic, other species will be richly diverse, thriving, resilient and adapting to climate change. Everyone will understand the benefits from and importance of biodiversity and will play their role in the stewardship of nature in Scotland for future generations. Minister Slater is fully informed on the progress and content and is content with the approach we're taking. Scottish Government colleagues are ensuring engagement with ministers, Ms Goujon and Ms McCallan, thus covering farming, forestry and marine portfolios. The vision and outcomes are framed under 9 broad land and seascapes shown here on the left. We're now working with members of the Programme Advisory Group, RESAS and NatureScot colleagues using logic modelling to identify actions needed to deliver those outcomes. So on the right there, you can see that we've worked with national and landscape-specific stakeholder groups. We're developing high-level outcomes that reflect the vision. And this is all being evidence-led and recognising where there's more work needed on gaps. We're trying to achieve clarity on opportunities, barriers and policy choices. And this is very much a work in progress. So we're going to take a couple of examples in this next slide. These are just a few examples of the outcome statements in the consultation documents. The outcome descriptions or end states have been produced for each of the land or seascapes for 2030 and 2045 milestones. So in woodland and forestry, for example, we want to see, or we will see, productive forests and woodlands that are designed and managed to deliver increased biodiversity and habitat connectivity whilst still sustaining timber production and carbon sequestration. And a range of nature recovery activity will enable the sustainable natural regeneration of woodlands, greater diversity of woodland species and woodland age structure, and increased woodland cover and connectivity between woodlands. For rivers, lochs and wetlands, catchment, river and floodplain restoration will be routinely accepted and used as a nature-based solution to climate impacts. Beavers, salmon recovery and riparian woodland will be evident as growing ecological components of restored rivers and wetlands. And in the marine environment, populations of marine mammals, marine birds and fish are healthy, have recovered and have increased resilience to the impacts of climate change. The health of the water column and seabed habitats has been enhanced so that they are more resilient, including to climate change, supporting wider ecosystem function and providing increased benefits to society. We're also thinking about appropriate targets to drive action to achieve these outcomes. With the Natural Environment Bill on the way and the ability to set targets within that, now is the time to begin identifying the best targets. Marine input is being worked on by marine colleagues through the Marine Programme Biodiversity Board. The work so far has identified common areas for action that will generate the greatest benefit. There's an appetite for regeneration of key habitats and species assemblages, not simply restoring to what we had in the past, but instead establishing a more resilient and viable body of biodiversity which is adapted to the climate ahead. There's been a recognised need for large-scale regeneration, and that work will address key drivers, for example, invasive non-native species, intensive land use practices, and adapting to climate change. There's a key opportunity here for nature-based solutions to meet the outcomes covering coastal, river, upland, woodland, and urban settings, all of them, to be honest. And there's a recognised massive need for a meaningful reduction in deer numbers. It's a key challenge to the functioning of and resilience of multiple terrestrial ecosystems. But alongside commonalities, there are some very challenging questions that have arisen. Restoration versus regeneration in underpinning resilience and baselines of looking ahead and not back. Not everybody's comfortable with that. Success depends on working at large scale to tackle the best drivers, for example, invasive non-native species, pollution, climate warming. A nature-based solutions approach is really important, but cooperation and community action is key. And what condition do our ecosystems need to be in to halt the loss of biodiversity by 2030? And we all know that deer management in the uplands, woodlands and lowlands is very challenging and resource heavy. Let's look at agriculture. That covers 70% of our land cover, and that has multiple objectives. So we have to kind of try and deliver all of those. And managing predation is going to be particularly sensitive when some of those species are for good reason highly protected. In terms of next steps, we're looking at the evidence of what practice is most likely to work, including what is already working, what innovations are most promising, and importantly, what has not worked. We don't want to continue that. We'll assess whether the landscape and seascape mid and end states and our cumulative actions will deliver what's needed to achieve the 2030 and 2045 visions. And we need to make sure that the strategy is sufficiently able to respond to the climate change projections and is contributing to adaptation and mitigation. The delivery plan is being developed at present. It's a bit behind the strategy, understandably, and it will follow the landscape and seascape model with a two-stage journey, 2030 and 2045. There will be indicators tracking progress against targets, and some of these will be enshrined in the Natural Environment Bill. Those indicators will be allow us to be agile and adaptive, so where things aren't working, we can change. And some elements, for example, 30 by 30 and nature networks, will be co-designed in parallel with the strategy. And I'm now going to hand over to Christian, who will talk us through those elements.
Hi, thank you. So, so I'm Christian Christodoulou Davies, and I'm the project manager for 30 by 30 and nature networks in NatureScot. Hopefully, I'm not a stranger to most of you here, having attended quite a lot of the HEF and Highlands Invasive Species Forums events over the years. So yeah, on screen at the moment, we just have two very brief overviews of the two commissions that NatureScot have got and received from Scottish Government. So for nature networks, there's a brief explanation, but really there isn't yet an agreed definition on what makes a nature network. And this is something that we're working on over the next 6 months. It is a national project, and we do know that each local authority area will be expected to have a nature network, and that some have already got underway in doing this. I should also maybe just say that for both the nature network and 30 by 30 projects, which I'm managing, it's strictly terrestrial, so I'm not looking at the marine environment. On the nature network side, whilst there isn't that kind of clear definition yet, it's really about recognizing that protected areas in isolation won't be enough. And so looking at finding ways of making sure that the space between protected areas is not hostile to nature. These networks hopefully will also bridge that gap from kind of wild areas to rural areas to urban areas and kind of start blurring the lines of what is a protected area. In the long run, it's likely that NatureScot's key role in these will be facilitating others in setting them up and maintaining nature networks rather than being like the lead organisation for them. So the second project is the 30 by 30 project. This one comes with a much clearer definition, which is up there on screen, and that's kind of provided from the kind of CBD framework that has been drawn up. But for the moment, I suppose I just want to draw your attention to the two underlined means within that of reaching 30%. And that is the kind of classic, although that's not to say that there couldn't be novel types of protected areas. So that could be triple SIs, SACs, SPAs, and national nature reserves are those types of protected areas that we're currently including within the percentage that we have in Scotland. So it could just be a case of more of those. But also these other effective area-based conservation measures, or OECMs, they can also be included when trying to reach 30%. OECMs, they differ from protected areas in that their primary objective does not have to be about nature conservation, but nature conservation does need to be one of their objectives. Other criteria out there for OECMs is that it can't be an existing protected area. There does need to be governance and management in place for it. It has to be effective and sustained positive outcomes for biodiversity, and that has to be over the long term. So it has to be kind of guaranteed that you're talking like over 30 years minimum. and should support ecosystem function and other values. I suppose the only other thing which is in that kind of definition, which is up on the screen, is straight away it talks about being protected and conserved through well-connected and effective system protected areas. So you can see immediately that link between the 30 by 30 projects and nature networks. For 30 by 30, it's likely that NatureScot will have a key role in the delivery of these protected areas, and that will most likely be statutory. Definitions aside, though, the point here, and I suppose the exciting point, is that this is an opportunity to bring considerably more of Scotland's terrestrial environment under some form of area-based conservation, and also to improve upon the existing protected areas that we have. Could we change slide? So this is just an infographic trying to show the jigsaw pieces that go together to form these two projects. So hopefully that's big enough for everyone to see. These kind of columns on the left, which kind of got a little heading there, 30 by 30, that's all about protected areas and OECMs. National parks already also in there, but with a bit of a question mark. There's kind of work currently underway to identify at least one new national park, and it's a prime opportunity to be looking at these designations and see how they can deliver for nature, and so count towards the 30%. But at the moment, I suppose it's not entirely sure what percent of the national park would be able to contribute towards that 30%, because they kind of have, I suppose, multiple uses, national parks. So yes, you've got your protected areas that we listed there, the national parks and these potential OECMs. And then the kind of broader, taken in the fourth category, the fourth column, that's nature networks, which is pulling in all those additional approaches to protecting, enhancing and connecting up nature. So that's the green networks, open space strategy, blue-green infrastructure, local initiatives. Maybe important to add that agricultural transformation possibly sits beside this and complements it, although there may be a possible role to play within nature networks. If we could change slides again. So that was a super brief overview of the two projects. I should say that for those of you maybe who have not been involved in these at all, then on the NatureScot webpage for the 30 by 30 and Nature Networks project, you can find materials there which summarises both those projects in a bit more detail, and also there's some videos that you can watch which go into more detail. But anyway, sorry, today was about how you can influence it, and so this slide here is showing the process that we're following for both projects. Both the frameworks are being created by a co-design process, and that is something that was stipulated in the commissions. Co-design may be a bit of a buzz term, I'm not sure, but really it's just like stakeholder engagement plus. So it's trying to take it further from just engaging with stakeholders and making sure that it is stakeholders that are actually driving the whole process and are creating it. So we try to call them co-creators rather than stakeholders. So the approach we're taking is this double diamond approach, which is what is on the screen at the moment. The purpose of the first diamond, which is the one on the left in blue, is making sure that all those people who have an interest, a stake or a role to play in these projects are able to take part in defining the problem. The idea there is it avoids NatureScot creating a framework for what we think the problems are, and that should mean that we end up with a much better product. We did this by first running a launch event back in June, where people could learn about the two projects and start to discover and think critically about them. It was kind of important that everyone started at the same place. This month, we've then focused this further and started to define the issues and challenges both projects faced through a further workshop, which split into multiple groups focusing on one of the projects, either 30 by 30 or nature networks. So that's taken us into this kind of shrinking side of the blue diamond. There's been a really great level of involvement with both the events that we've run so far. I think both had well over 100 attendees, and perhaps more importantly, had something like 90 plus different organizations represented from a really broad spectrum of interests and expertise. So that was kind of your environmental NGOs, local authorities, traditional land management groups, individual crofts and farms, and then, you know, some various government bodies and regulatory authorities who I suppose, you know, they know they're going to have a role to play in this. The next diamond, the kind of yellowy mustardy one on the right, is where we're heading to next. And that is going to be starting to design the solutions to these challenges that have been identified by the co-creators of the framework. We'll be running workshops through September and October, and they're going to be focusing on the themes which have been identified in the previous workshops. And whilst it's better if you've been involved from the beginning, there's absolutely no reason why anyone who hasn't been can't join in and take part in these kind of latter workshops that we're going to be running. We're still in the process of pulling together all the information from the last workshop that was run on the 18th of August. But what we do have so far is the kind of broad themes for both 30 by 30 and nature networks. And within those themes, we've got the main challenges as identified by the co-creators. And so these next workshops are going to be very small groups, probably quite lengthy, probably looking at about 4 hours, just going through those various challenges and kind of coming with solutions that they see that can then make it into their framework. Next slide, please, Sue. That is just a timeline. So I think I've probably covered that pretty much, but you can see the team. So there's myself, and then there's Abby Gardner and Bob Bryson, 2 project officers. We only got together in June of this year, so we've started up, so it's been quite hectic, and then we're in this kind of period of co-design workshops, which is running from really, it was the end of June, and we're expecting that to run through till mid-October. And then we will start with the framework development, with the anticipation of that going out to consultation early in the new year, with publication in, I think, around June. And then it's kind of missing from this, but I suppose the critical part is pretty much as soon as that goes for publication, then you move into implementation. And I suppose one of the things I should have said is for both projects, as well as developing a framework, at the same time, we have to be developing an implementation plan to make sure that people can get going pretty much straight away afterwards, because from 2023 to 2030, when we need all of this land protected, is not a long time. Next slide. Oh yeah, that's my final one. So this is just how to get involved. As I said, if you've not already been involved in the project so far, then that's the email address, and I'm sure Caroline will pump it out after this. But yeah, Nature Networks and Nature.Scot, that's the email address for both of the projects at the moment. And so if you were to drop an email to that and say that you were interested in taking part in some of those themed workshops, which are going to be coming up in September and October, then we can certainly put you on the mailing list and make sure that you're invited to those. That's it for me.
Thanks very much, Christian. So I'll sum up. Here's our challenge, and it's a big one. We need to bend the curve from the grey to the green, and we all have a part to play in that. The next stages are here in Scotland until the 12th of September. There's a consultation on the Scottish Biodiversity Strategy. I'm seeing lots of interesting comments in the chat, and it would be really great if some of those could get transformed into responses to the consultation. The final part of COP15 will be held in person in Montreal, Canada in December. And here in Scotland, the Scottish Biodiversity Strategy will be published. Within 6 months, its delivery plan will also be published, so that's early 2023. And finally, the Natural Environment Bill will be considered by Parliament in 2024. Thank you for your time and your thoughts today. We welcome your suggestions, comments and questions. And I think Tez is going to take those in the first instance. Thanks very much.
Yeah, thanks very much, Sue and Christian. And thanks everyone for this slew of comments that are appearing, which is absolutely brilliant. There's some fantastic comments coming through there. Urgency of action, community involvement, land reform, some really great comments there. And Nathan, I think it would help if you're happy to sort of moderate this, because you'll know many of the individuals, and it would be good to hear from people who are posing the questions, if that's all right, because sometimes the meaning can be lost in the wording. I'm very happy just to see if we can get a free-flowing conversation around these very important questions.
Yeah, not a problem. So if I can just remind people, everybody's muted at the moment. So if you remember to unmute when I ask you to come in and ask your question. But the first question was from Katie Malone. Are you there, Katie?
Katie, are you there? You were asking about specialist species and why they're so important. And Katie, if you're just hooking up, I mean, of course, in Scotland, and dare I say it, in the Highlands, we're extremely fortunate to have so many specialist species, especially the Arctic alpine, hyperoceanically related species, that for which we have globally important populations and assemblages. So that's why we place very heavy emphasis on our specialist species. And of course, because they're specialists, they're especially vulnerable to climate change and many other forms of change. If Katie's not there, Nathan, we'll probably just keep going because there's so many important questions.
Yeah, the next comment was David Danoon talking about the cost of living crisis and what the government priorities are and how they're going to deal with this. David, did you want to come in here?
Yeah, it was just given the current climate of where we're still having an impact of COVID, now the cost of living crisis. What's the feeling of how seriously the government are taking this? Are they already seriously going to fund all this work? Because all we know is like a lot of our agencies are underfunded, under-resourced, are struggling to deliver what they're already signed up to. And obviously, later I asked about urgency of action, trying to get things rolling as soon as possible because we've got a finite window to actually start getting this in place before, the impact on climate change and biodiversity impacts become irreversible. So yeah, I'm just, with everything that's going on in the world just now, how high a deal is this to government? I know most of the public are probably not that bothered about it just now and worried because they're too busy trying to worry about heating and eating this winter.
So David, absolutely, in terms of sort of the wider concerns and the pressures we're facing at the moment. But what I can tell you is that Minister Slater and colleagues are unflinching in terms of the concentration on the issues here. They really do want to see this through. We have a nature climate crisis, and frankly, a lot of the issues and problems we're facing at the moment actually derive from the nature climate crisis. So we can't put off action. We've got to take the concerted action now and to show the full commitment towards addressing this. You think back to COVID and how COVID started. It started from a broken ecosystem. And had we managed certain ecosystems better, we could have avoided this pandemic. And then you look at the great benefits that people have derived from nature in surviving the pandemic. So all along, we've got to think about the solutions that nature can provide to a lot of these problems.
I think probably everyone on this call will agree with you there, but I'm not sure that the public and the government are fully bought in. I'm not sure. I don't know.
Well, I think we've got a job to do there. I agree with you. Looking at the news, you do wonder, but then actually you look at what's happened in Australia recently, what's happening in Pakistan at the moment. You look at the problems in the desertified parts of the world, the mass migrations we're seeing, the warfare we're seeing are actually due to limited resources. They're due to lack of water and lack of food, amongst other problems. So all the time, we have to remind people of the importance of tackling the nature climate crisis. So as far as our ministers are concerned, they remain absolutely focused on taking action, and that is reassuring, but we cannot be complacent, and we can't be complacent about the sort of timing of all this. I think it was Jill who was mentioning this further down the line in terms of taking our urgent action now. Absolutely, we've got to get the consultation right, we've got to get the community engagement right, but we've also got to be mindful that we're facing a nature climate emergency. We've got to think of future generations and the legacy we're leaving behind. So take your point, David. But I can only provide you so much reassurance on the basis of what I'm seeing and hearing from ministers and officials.
Thanks, David. Okay, next question was from Jill. Apologies, I don't have your surname, Jill, but you want to ask about use of the word sustainable and over regenerative or holistic.
Yeah, I'm just finding that we are still using something that was pertinent in the 1980s, and we're so far beyond the fact that anything we have now is sustainable. We have to be far more active, proactive, urgent, and the only way to actually begin to solve any of our problems is to be regenerative. We have got to repair, not just stand still. And adding into this the holistic management, where we're actually thinking forward, we're being collaborative, we're looking across the whole of the sectors that are involved in our land. So it's not just nature places and food places, that they have to be completely and utterly integrated. And when you do start doing that, then you inherently get better agriculture, and you better food production, and you get better food resilience, and you instantly get better nature and diversity and what have you. I'm sitting outside on my 24 acres where I've only just started this process, but the diversity is just already immense and growing, but we've got to get that out into we've got to, I think, separate the them and the us in any part of food production and nature and what have you. And this seems to be doing it again, of we're on an unurgent level of sustainable, and we're on a nature or food agenda, which I don't think is where we need to be.
So I think, so absolutely very well put, Jill. And you'll have seen in bending the curve slide that Sue's shown, and for the vision that we're aiming for, it's large scale regeneration and restoration that's writ large. And in terms of agriculture, it is very much regenerative agriculture that we're thinking of now. So as you say, beyond sustainable food supplies, it's actually regenerating the carbon and the biodiversity in the soils that is so important. So I'm just going to say there, we wholeheartedly agree with you, Jill, in terms of moving into this space of regenerating nature and the sort of wider benefits to be derived from that. And the louder you can shout about that in responding to the consultation, the better, because that helps us immensely with the conversations we have with forestry and agriculture colleagues.
Excellent. Okay, Texas Sim, you had a question about certain activities that are damaging but looking to expand.
Nathan, just before we stop there, Drew, have you put your hand up? Are you wanting to come in with something there? Sorry, Nathan. No,
okay.
Apologies.
You're on mute, Drew.
Yeah.
What I was going to say is that I chair the Monolea Deer Management Group, and we're just starting the process of rebuilding our next 10-year plan. The Monolea is a big area in the middle of the Highlands, and we've already begun the process of discussing what we're going to be doing, what the things that we must do, the things that we should do, and the things that we could do in the next 10 years in the Monoleas. So I definitely want to talk to whoever it is that's leading this discussion just now. Sometime this year, I will want to talk to them. I'm going up to Granton tomorrow to start that process with the Cairngorm National Park. And I'm also putting out feelers for other organisations in and around the Monolea Mountains, so that I make sure that I've got everyone to talk to. So absolutely, this is the right time. I want to come and talk to you guys, and I bring a big organisation with me.
That's great, Drew. And the sort of peatland action programme is absolutely vital as part of that. And I know there have been some discussions over that in the Monoleas already. So that's great, Drew. Thank you. Apologies, sorry, I'd just seen the hand go up there, Nathan.
That's okay. Texa, you wanted to come in here.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I'm Texa. I'm from the Community Association of Lochs and Sounds. We're a community conservation group in Ardnamurchan and Morvern and the Sinnet areas. Yeah, my question is about activities that are detrimental to the environment, particularly in the marine environment. And obviously there's evidence, and the government's own science comes out with evidence that suggests that some of these activities are damaging not only to priority marine features, but also to habitats and protected areas. And some of these commercial activities are trying to expand, and that's happening without changing particular practices or the status quo which we're currently in. It's really hard to imagine how those can fit into the marine environmental outcomes that are in the proposed strategy. So I was just wondering if a wee bit of clarity on that. Thank you.
On this, thank you. They've almost got to, given the ambition we've got for restoring the marine environment. 36% of our seas are protected, but they're not managed for protection. So we've got to get better at that. And this is absolutely on the news this morning. In fact, only this morning in Farming Today there was a discussion about aquaculture in relation to salmon recovery. So this is a very live issue, and we've just got to make sure that this comes through in the consultation, and then when we go on to developing the work streams around delivering action, that we're bringing the right players together in order to effect change. But actually, Tex, I think this is going to be one of the most challenging areas, looking at how the aquaculture sector is responding, and the sort of the economic, the contribution to the economy it's making. We're really going to have to work hard at resolving a better future in this area. So I think this is going to be very difficult. I haven't got an easy answer, but through the consultation, we've got to make sure that this is high up for significant attention.
Yeah, Andrew Pulse wanted just to come in on that point.
Thanks, Nathan. Do you see then, just on the aquaculture issue, do you see a contradiction between the strategy and MPF4, the draft MPF4, which has specifically excluded aquaculture from delivering biodiversity enhancements? And how is that going to contribute towards the strategy?
Well, we'll have to see how MPF4 plays out. It's still got to go in front of Parliament, and that's imminent. So I think the parliamentary debate on that will be very important, Andrew, but we can't have two separate strands of government policy that are acting against one another. So we'll have to find a resolution here, but it is difficult, which is why I'm agreeing with you, Texa, that there's a real challenge here that we've got to work through, but it's not easy.
Okay, thank you. The next question was from Emma Watson about the resilience of populations and habitats and how they're measured.
Emma, do you want to just add to that? Because, I mean, populations and assemblages are resilient if they're able to withstand the sorts of shocks that are being thrown at them, and whether these are anthropogenic shocks or natural shocks. But have you got any examples in mind?
Hi. Sorry if you had talked about this before, because I joined a little bit late. But really, I was just wondering, because it seems to be not so much a buzzword, but you do kind of see this term resilience and improving resilience. And I just wondered if that was quantified or measured by something, in terms of, is it because, you see less population declines, or is it measured against like baseline numbers, or how's that?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, Emma, and it's a really important issue, thinking about some of the species populations, whether it's capercaillie in our forests or ptarmigan, for instance, on the high tops, to pick two bird examples. And these populations are more resilient if the habitats that these species are occupying are well managed. If they're not well managed, and if there are all sorts of forces at play acting against these species, they're more likely to succumb to pressures, whether that's sort of heavy rainfall or extremes in weather. And that's what we're thinking of resilience here, doing what we can to make these populations more resilient to the sorts of shocks they're encountering. And we're very fortunate in terms of having very long-term data sets that give us a sense of how well or how poorly populations are doing, and what sort of form of land management is needed in order to ensure that these assemblages become more resilient. So it's an important point, Emma. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, I know we've got a couple of folk with hands up, so
yeah, sure. Just
Fiona, did you want to come in and ask your question?
Hi there, thanks very much. Fiona Morrison, I'm based in Newest. I lived on a croft. I'm very much involved with population of people, and I'm also chair of Scottish Rural Action. And I just wanted to ask you, and Des, you did mention about not wanting things to sort of be left hand and right hand in terms of what's happening at government level. So I wondered how all of this articulated, for example, with the Good Food Nation bill, which has just gone through Parliament just now. And obviously every local authority, I mean, you mentioned in the presentation today about habitat corridors and stepping stones and all that for local authorities, but also we've got this whole business with the Good Food Nation bill. And, you know, we know that Britain imports at least 42% of its food, and that 80% of our arable production in Scotland is going to distilling and animal feed. And in under MPF4, the west coast of Scotland, where I am, and the Western Isles, in many ways, crofting that has often been dissed as being second place to farming in some respects because of its very low intensive method of agriculture. And yet in many ways, if you flip that over and go, well, OECD say that 80% of the world's land biodiversity that's left is stewarded by just 6% of the population who are Indigenous peoples. And the Gaels here, both the Scottish Gaels and the Irish Gaels, don't have Indigenous status, but they have that intergenerational knowledge, the same knowledge that the likes of James Rebanks is talking about in his book that he got from his grandfather and so on. And putting seaweed on the land, it's still happening today. I drove past a field of oats today, and that's all they've had on them, etc. So I'm very concerned about, you know, it's no good when you've got Highland, which is the size of Belgium, and yet just 400,000 acres are in the hands of 3 people who are just going to whack trees up on it and take land out of food production. And yet I totally am on side with biodiversity, habitat corridors, all that kind of thing. But I really think that we need to articulate how we will feed Scotland, keep a population in rural Scotland that can work the land in a, you know, in a biodiverse and sustainable kind of way. At the moment, Scotland is 98% rural, but with only 17% of the population. And yet it is rural and island Scotland that produces the potential of this food in a sustainable way, instead of importing on all these ships and hosting renewable energy. We need to get this conversation really joined up and look at the lived experience of those who can read the land. I mean, even James Rebank today, you know, he's just saying pulse grazing is important. The field that had a long recovery, then mob grazing event for 2 days. So you have time for biomass, insect life cycles, seeding, flowering, then a major disturbance with the flock that disturbs the insects. The rest, then rest again. The swallows get it. There are people on the land who understand this stuff. I would also say farmers have been pushed into a corner and made to supply markets. Sorry, that was a lot to say. Sorry.
No, because you've said it beautifully, and it's absolutely spot on. And so and of course we've got the land reform consultation running at the moment. It was launched in July, and that's going, hopefully the outcome of that will have a very important bearing on what you're saying. And I'd also say at COP15 that Sue mentioned in Montreal, actually Indigenous communities are being given or will be given a stronger voice if the framework is signed off as we hoped. So actually that should play into the hands of rural communities and ensuring that they get enhanced resourcing for what I think you're describing as regenerative farming.
Absolutely.
Which has been done over, well, centuries.
Absolutely.
To great effect.
Yeah.
And what we need is
Yeah.
far greater support for that and for the fantastic nature that's supported by it.
Yeah, yeah, thanks.
Yeah. So
yeah.
no, very, very, very well said.
So this sort of comes into the comments, the questions asked by Councillor Bell and Councillor Willis. So
Okay.
I wonder if Councillor Bell wanted to come in first.
I'm quite happy to leave my points in the chat. I think I've made them and have made them in many other forums over recent times. For other new points to come in, happy for that.
So
Okay.
Kate, just to say on that, if I may, reform will be needed. Some form of reform will be needed to achieve the vision and outcomes we have in mind. I can't say how much reform, but some will be needed. So what you're setting out there is a real challenge. I mean, to get large-scale restoration, you're just thinking of Cairngorms and seeing how well Cairngorms Connect is working at the moment, with the number of partners working. It would be fantastic to have that working more widely across the Highlands and Islands. But I'll leave it hanging at that if I may. But it's a very well made point.
Okay. David, Janine, you had another question, but I wonder if that's partly been discussed previously or whether you'd like to ask that.
It's kind of an extension, really. On the first presentation, there was discussions on different strategies, and from my own personal experience, I'm aware of many different action plans, sector plans from SEPA, river basin management planning. Then there's marine spatial planning, the blue economy, all these different strategies that are coming out or are already out. And I'm just wondering how much of this ties together, where overlapping actions can deliver similar or the same kind of outcomes that can boost or tackle climate change and the biodiversity problems. But
So
I'm not sure how much of that is interlinked by the different agencies.
I think it has to be interlinked. And Sue's, the diagram Sue was showing of the different strategies, and then thinking forward to the delivery plan, which is going to be so crucial to this when we go out to consultation on the delivery plan in February, March, and then publish the first iteration in June next year. That has got to brigade the whole range of activities. Otherwise, we'll just bore people to death with inactivity, with different strategies and different action plans and different programs not working together. So this is the golden thread we've got here is through the delivery plan. We can try and synergize and pull together a whole range of these different activities. And the key thing here is we've got a ministerial commitment to do this. I mean, it is something we mustn't forget. We are in a economically, we are, in terms of government support, we're in a very different climate. We've had £65 million for a nature restoration fund. We've got a £250 million investment going into peatland action. These are very significant resources. So we need to make sure we get full value for money in terms of it taking action forward.
Okay. Texa, you had another question about community conservation groups.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, I think Des, you might have answered it partly already. It was just to reiterate basically that community groups like the one I'm part of, especially in the coastal areas, so we're part of the Coastal Communities Network, the CCN, and so many restoration projects are being undertaken by these groups, and this includes seagrass and oysters, and there's obviously scope to include other habitats and or species. However, the problem is that obviously capacity is really limited in these groups, particularly because most of the members are volunteers. There are very few paid positions in these groups, and that does restrict what they can do. And we know what they can do can be very positive and really engaging for the community, as well as bringing in a biodiversity element. So this might be more a part of the implementation stage later on, but could that possibly include tangible support for community groups and conservation groups?
I think it has to, because unless we have that, we're just going to trade on people's voluntary time. Whereas we know for some groups where we have resourcing, we've got dedicated staff time, thinking of, for instance, the Ascent group, for instance, it just makes a world of difference in terms of being able to convene people together and in terms of identifying work that can be taken forward. So for actually not just rural Scotland, for urban Scotland as well, community action is absolutely vital. And it's actually something that Minister Slater has been emphasising, given her own experience of working with local community groups. And unless we have the ability to convene these with real resources, we're just going to be trading on people's time. So it's a very important point, and I hope something that's going to come through very loudly when we consult on the delivery plan, where local communities will simply say, we want to do this, we want to work with you, but we can't do it unless we get some resourcing.
Thank you, that's really great to hear.
And by the way, that resourcing is not just public funding, you know, that's also coming from businesses and other organisations as well.
Okay, I know Sean Flynn has his hand up.
Yeah,
Sean, do you want to come in?
Hi, yeah. This is in regarding David's actual first point about public's priorities at the moment. I was wondering if there's any sort of plan for increased public engagement with public demand being so important and having had such a significant effect in the past.
So just to, what is it you're thinking of there, Sean? I mean, we're certainly working much more with stakeholders, and through the consultation, we've actually been reaching out to some hard to reach groups. I mean, Young Scot, for instance, is an organisation we've been reaching into. So I just want to check I understand your question here, Sean. Do we need to work harder at engaging with more communities?
So just in my opinion, I think we do, as conservationists, do a great job of engaging young people. And as a result, we've got this incredibly empathetic generation who are very interested in conservation issues. I'm more talking about other generations, including my own generation, who aren't across the board interested in conservation. Is there a plan to engage those groups? So public demand across all age groups? Like Blue Planet 2, for example, Blue Planet 2 had a massive effect in increasing public awareness for conservation issues.
So the answer is yes, but it's not fully thought through yet, and that's because some of these groups are very difficult to identify, and therefore being clear about how you can reach these groups is quite challenging. But you know, we have talked about, for instance, a nature assembly, in the way that we've had successful climate assemblies. So I think the jury's out on that one, Sean, but it's the real frustration is when we can't reach groups who could have real influence. You know, as you say, Young Scot, the young generation, they absolutely get it, but it's some of the slightly older groups and entrenched sectors that are much harder to reach into.
Okay, Councillor Devine, you had also a question about growing trees for carbon offsetting. Did you want to come in here?
I think that may come down to the land reform issues. So I don't really want to continue that, but I think we really have to be quite radical in this respect, because I was reading a bit about the borders, I think it was, where there have been vast tracts of land bought and not broadleaf trees being planted. Now, we all know that they're much slower to grow, but they are what we need. So I just don't know. Have you thought about this? Have you put anything forward to the minister? Yeah.
Yes, we have, and that point is extremely well made. And how can I put it? There are some quite challenging conversations taking place within government at the moment over the future of forestry and the sorts of trees that should be planted. You know, it's Sitka spruce, as you say, which is a very good carbon sequester under certain conditions, versus some of the hardwood species that are so much better for biodiversity. You use the word radical, and perhaps the Royal Society of Edinburgh is just beginning a commission of inquiry on tree planting and forestry, and there'll be a public announcement about this next month. Now, I don't normally associate Royal Society of Edinburgh with radical thinking, but I think here we are looking for some very important direction in terms of how forest policy might be directed. It's a very difficult one, because we know we need more tree planting, responsible tree planting, and we need more woodland regeneration. We also know that Scotland is very poorly represented in terms of woodland cover, so we need to see these increases, but it's got to be done well and appropriately at the right scale. So my response to you is that we are very live to this particular issue, and I think land reform, as in the previous question, will have an important bearing on this in terms of the funding that goes into woodland regeneration.
Okay, I'm aware that we're over time, but
Sure.
I wonder if we could just get a couple more questions.
Course,
And
yep.
So Ian McLeod, you had a question about invasive non-native species management. Did you want to come in here?
Yeah, sorry, Des, it is me again.
Greetings, Ian. Great to hear from you.
No, it's really just to emphasize the need for invasive non-native control before we do anything else, because there was a really interesting piece on Country File, not a program I watch very often, and if you exclude some of the animal rights issues they brought into it, it demonstrated that a really visionary landowner with professional foresters 20 years ago planted deciduous woodlands and did significant deer control. But the population of grey squirrels exploded. 20 years on, there's not a single tree that he planted that survived. They've all been ring-barked. So we need to get it right, as everybody's been saying. It needs to be cohesive. The agricultural support schemes, in a question later on, have been putting huge amounts of money into habitats to create wader-rich grasslands. And in the US, thank you, Fiona, for bigging up the Outer Hebrides, huge amounts of money going into wader-rich grasslands, but not enough into managing the invasive species that are eating their eggs, the chicks, and the adult birds. If it's not joined up, it simply won't work.
Yeah. So Ian, we've discussed this many times, and I agree with you, and I hope the Scottish SISI, the Scottish Invasive Species Initiative, can get a boost to expand its work, because it's fantastic what it's doing. And you know, the INS, tackling invasive species, that's one of what's called the IPBES drivers, one of the 5 direct drivers. And we've just got to put real resourcing into tackling some of these, whether it's hedgehogs or rats on islands, or sika deer or muntjac. We've just got to put proper resources into this, or mink, of course. So
Yeah,
good point.
I would agree, Des, and currently it's extremely difficult to get the money to actually get into the planning and the research that Christian was talking about. That funding doesn't exist. If you've got a easily managed, easily developed project to take you to a conclusion within 2 or 3 years, then you can do the funding. If it's a long scale, 10, 15-year project at landscape scale to deliver huge amounts of biodiversity gain, getting money to develop the project is extremely hard, and that's what we need.
Yeah. Christian, do you want to come in on that?
Cheers, Ian. Yeah, I mean, yeah, hi, you're right. I don't think I necessarily have anything to say about on that, but certainly that was something that was coming through in the Nature Networks group. No, sorry, the 30 by 30 group that I was in recently at the workshop, when people were talking about the kind of issue of the structure of funding that can be applied for. For them, it was slightly different. They were talking about the issues of the large numbers of tenant farmers and the kind of difficulties there where kind of funding for various schemes would benefit potentially the owner rather than the tenant. But I think it's part of that larger issue that the current funding schemes which are out there don't seem to be fit for purpose, and I think that that's something which presumably will be coming through in the consultation, and likewise in the 30 by 30 Nature Networks project, that is something that's coming through, and therefore you can presume we'll be making it into the framework as kind of one of those kind of key principles for how to achieve the vision, is that the funding has to in some way better match the genuine needs.
So it needs to be
sorry, that's not
large.
much of an answer.
No, it is. It needs to be large scale and operating over a longer time scale. Ian, we'll pick this up out with the meeting if that's all right, because this is important. And I thought we'd made some progress towards tackling this, but it sounds like we haven't. Thank you. Nathan.
Yeah. So just lastly, one thing for me, I notice David mentions that about the Highland Council Nature Restoration Fund, that there's not much time there. It was only 2 weeks deadline. That's just for expressions of interest, David. So that's a very short summary of a potential project. It doesn't have to be necessarily all the details in line. So if you've got any sort of projects in mind, you know, get in touch with the project team or get in touch with myself, and we can probably be a bit flexible with the dates as well. So yeah, just get in touch. And also, just last question I wanted to ask was from Nicole Wallace, who I know has had to duck out, but she wanted to ask how all of this positive change is going to be delivered and what sort of resources will be made available and what the role of local authorities will be in that. I know there's quite a few councillors and local authority members on here, so.
Well, so I've mentioned the Nature Restoration Fund, so that's a fantastic injection of resourcing. We've also got the Edinburgh Declaration, which will be signed off at COP15, and actually local government, local authorities are very much in the sights of that Edinburgh Declaration. So we need to make sure, as we're doing in our working relationship with COSLA at the moment, that we've got greater traction with local authorities in terms of implementing some of the actions that we want to see coming through in the delivery plan. Because again, without local authority traction, we're not going to, we're not going to succeed at the sort of scale we want to succeed at. So I think I'm heartened in that local authorities are more engaged in the process than they were for the previous biodiversity strategy.
Okay.
And I should just say on that, Nicole, of course, is a great ambassador for Highland Council. I mean, her sort of efforts for the environment are fantastic. And I say that having worked with her directly.
Thanks very much, Des. Well, I'm sure everyone will join me in thanking Sue, Christian and Des for their time, for answering our questions. Apologies we haven't been able to get through everybody's questions. as I said, the recording will be made available to Caroline. Will send it out to everybody probably in a couple of days' time, and we will try and make the meeting chat available as well. And yeah, just to encourage everybody to respond to the NatureScot consultation on the Scottish Biodiversity Strategy as well. And
Thanks.
a final plug for the Nature Restoration Fund at the Highland Council. Get your project ideas in.
Quite right. Nathan, just a wee plea from me, if at all possible. It would be great to repeat this, if possible, when we're further down the line with developing the delivery plan, because a lot of the commentary has touched on delivery and this sort of impact we can have and how we can work, especially with the rural communities thinking, for instance, about what we've heard about from the US, for instance. So if we could have another slot with you further down the line, that would be immensely helpful. These are great comments we've got in the chat here. So thank you.
Yeah, I'm sure I'll speak to Caroline, but I can't imagine there'd be any reservations about that. Sounds like a great idea to come back and have these sorts of discussions when we're a bit further on. And yeah, we'll be sure to advertise that to everybody and make everybody aware of that when it's coming round.
Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. All the best.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.